Hello, today we're going to talk about Focus on the Learner, written assignment number 1 from the Cambridge CELTA course at International House, Mexico. In this video, we're going to cover marking criteria, how to write your paper, and some common mistakes candidates make when they submit their assignment. So let's get started. First, I'll show you the marking criteria. Now, this is the assessment criteria set out by Cambridge for the paper. If you'd like a copy of this, you could find this on the CELTA Moodle site. You could go to the CELTA Moodle, go into your portfolio, and go scroll down to the written assignments, click on Focus on the Learner, and it'll bring you to this page here. And you could click on this here, where it talks about the rubric, and you could download a copy of the assessment criteria on PDF. So let's move on to how to write your paper. It breaks down into 5 steps. First step's fairly straightforward. You choose a learner. Now, there's 2 different types of learners you could choose from for this paper. You could choose to work with an individual and focus on their specific problems, or you could work with a group or a class and focus on their shared problems. So once you narrow down what type of learner you'd like to work with, now you have to go find your learner. So if you teach already and you have access to students, you can use one of them. Or if you don't, that's fine. You could use a student from one of your TP groups that you're teaching on the course. Either way, once you have your learner, we have to get to know them a little bit. So we have to collect some data. Now, it doesn't matter if you're working with an individual or if you're working with a group, the information you have to collect is the same. We have to collect their basic information, like their name, level, nationality, and their first language. We have to get some learning background, specifically English learning background from them. Their motivation, their reason for learning English. This is a nice place here to add some terminology about motivation, so you could go back to your units and take advantage of that. We also need to find out about their learning preferences and the types of tasks and activities they enjoy most in class. And this will be helpful for the part B that we write. We also need to learn about their strengths and weaknesses. And make sure when you do this, you find out about strengths and weaknesses from both systems and skills. So grammar, lexis, pronunciation, and the 4 skills. Now, there's different ways you could gather all this information. One way would be to have your learner complete a needs analysis questionnaire or survey. Another one would be to do an interview, or you could do both. That's up to you, but either way, you're going to have to get a written sample. An idea for this is to give them a written prompt, or a writing prompt rather, that they could write against. Or you could write maybe an introductory email or letter to them and ask them to reply in kind. And that'd be another way to get a written sample. You'll also have to get a spoken sample from them. If you're working with an individual, you could have an interview, record the interview. If you're working with a group, you could always record the class and you could get a spoken sample that way. So once you've gathered all this information, all this data, we could start writing Part A. So Part A is the learner profile. It kind of breaks down into 2 parts. The first part is about the learner. So the basic information you gathered, their learning background, their motivation, their different learning preferences and types of activities they enjoy in class. All about the learner. Now the second part focuses a little bit more on their strengths and weaknesses in English. And again, make sure that we talk about a balance of strengths and weaknesses, and that we have examples of grammar, lexis, pronunciation, and the 4 skills. Just a nice balance. You don't have to have one from each category, but just a nice balance across the boards. Yes, and this analysis is going to help you prepare for the second part of the assignment. So the learning profile, or the learner profile here, is about 550 to 700 words. Now you will have to support your observations, and you'll have to reference some books. One really good book for this paper is Learner English by Smith and Swan. They analyze common problems that various non-native speakers have according to their first language. And here at IH Mexico, we tend to have a lot of Spanish speakers as our students. So the relevant pages here are page 90 to 112. But in the book, they analyze over 20 other L1s. So no matter where your student is from, you'll probably be able to find some background information and common problems of their first language. So that wraps up part A of the paper. Before we move on to part B, we have to do a needs analysis. So what we have to do here is first, we have to identify 2 key language areas where your learner needs help. Now you could focus on grammar, lexis, or pronunciation, but the 2 problems have to be from different areas, which means you can't have 2 grammar problems or 2 pronunciation problems, right? They have to come from 2 different areas. Once you do that, you have to find 2 examples of the same type of problem from the written or spoken sample. So an example of this might be, I did an interview with my learner, and we were talking about his job, and he said, I learned how to make websites instead of I learned how to make websites. A little bit later on in the interview, we were talking about his son, and he said, I asked him a question instead of I asked him a question. And so here, we could see that the problem is that this learner doesn't know the pronunciation rules for the past tense regular verbs. And so I found 2 of the same problem from the samples and focused on that. So again, focus on 2 key language areas and find 2 examples of the same problem. Once you've done that, we have to find a way to correct the problem. And this is where you would find a task or an activity to help your learner with the problem. And you do need a task or activity for each problem. So you'll have 2 different tasks. Now they have to come from published materials. So you can't just create your own, but you cannot use the course books you used on the CELTA course. So the books you use for the TPs, you can't use any of those, but you can use any other course book or published material that's available. And once you find the tasks, make sure you remember to attach those tasks in the appendix. That is a criteria, so make sure that's done. So we've identified the 2 key language problems. We've found 2 of the same problems for each of the 2 identified problems, grammar, lexis, and pronunciation. So for example, we found 2 grammar, 2 of the same problems for grammar, and 2 of the same problems for pronunciation. We've found an activity to address these issues. So now we could start thinking about part B. So here in part B, you give a rationale for why you chose the activities that you chose. Why did you choose the specific area for the learner? What exactly does the activity you chose practice? Now here you don't have to go into how you would deliver it in the lesson. You just have to say what the activity practices. And finally, of course, your rationale for why it's appropriate for your learner. And so this whole section will be about 200 to 300 words. And I have a suggested layout here for you. Again, just a suggestion on the way to organize your writing. The first paragraph would be the learner profile, about 150 to 200 words. That's just the basic information, background information, motivations, and learning styles. And then we would go into the language problems in paragraph 2. So that's about 400 to 500 words. This is where you identify the 2 key language areas, you find the examples, and you analyze the problem. And in the third paragraph, we would suggest the activities to help with these problems, 200 to 300 words. Again, this is just a suggested layout, but you're free to lay out your paper however you'd like. Yeah. Now let's go over some common mistakes. So before you hand in your paper, double check these things here. A lot of times you include the basic information and then they forget to include the level of the learner. So make sure that gets snuck in there with the basic information of the learner so it's out of the way. Another thing that's common is they don't include enough information about motivation or learning preferences. So again, make sure that you go deep enough here. Why are they learning English and what are their learning preferences and how did you come to this conclusion, right? What evidence do you have to support this? Then the profile, it doesn't have a balance of strengths and weaknesses, right? So again, make sure it's a balance of strengths and weaknesses and it comes from both skills and systems areas. Another common problem, the strengths and weaknesses aren't specific enough. And again, this is why it's important to make sure you have those concrete examples from the samples that you got from your learners. And next problem, the task that you recommend is too general. So in the example of my learner with the problem with the pronunciation there of the past tense, I can't just say I'll review the past tense with him. That's too general. The problem has to specifically address the identified issue. And again, make sure that whatever task you choose is clearly linked to the problem identified. Make sure you attach those activities into the appendix. Again, very important. And make sure you have those concrete examples that come from the written or spoken text. And of course, make sure you have references to back up and support your claims. And don't forget the cover page. That one's not a big deal, but don't forget the cover page. It's important.